Hello and welcome to an initial video review for the Triumph Speed Twin 1200. This is the 2019 version, which I've had for about 2 weeks. In this video, I'll just give you a rundown of my initial impressions. I'll briefly go over the specs, but I won't go into too much detail because that's something which a number of other videos have done very well indeed. But I will put them on the screen just here for you, just for the ones who do want to have a quick look through. So this is, in my humble opinion, an absolute gem of a motorcycle. This is a 1200cc parallel twin. It produces around about 96 horsepower and about 112.5 Newton meters of torque. Now this is an engine which is actually used in a couple of other Triumph models as well. Namely the Thruxton, in fact, on which this bike is based, and also the Scrambler and the T120 as well. The difference in this one is that, like the Thruxton, it is a little more powerful. It is tuned to have a slightly higher peak horsepower and a little more torque as well. So this is indeed the most powerful of the Bonneville engines. So I got one of these as a replacement for my Triumph Bonneville Scrambler 900. Now that was a bike I liked an awful lot. It had plenty of character, and even despite having a comparative lack of power, it still had plenty of torque, and it was a really fun bike to own and just ride around town. The only thing I was missing from that bike, as I've alluded to just now, was simply just the lack of power and lack of something which had a bit more speed to it. And interestingly, despite being based on the Thruxton, this is a bike that rather strikes me as being a bike that the Thruxton would be based on, rather than the other way round. In terms of ergonomics, it is a little more upright, it's a little more suitable for everyday use, as it were. So the foot pegs are in a bit more of a neutral position, the handlebars are a little more upright. In my case, just because of my height and my frame, the handlebars have actually been rotated upwards slightly to allow it to be a bit more comfortable to use. That is something I will get onto a little bit later. So in terms of what it's like to ride and the ergonomics, it is surprisingly good for going around town. You would imagine that a bike at 96 horsepower, or indeed anything beyond that, might not be so useful for going around every day, but certainly in my experience, riding this around town with the addition of traction control and various modes as well does really help an awful lot. It's certainly a very powerful bike, but for me, it definitely doesn't feel too intimidating or too powerful at all. In terms of ergonomics, I was pleasantly surprised, actually. There's no getting away from the fact that I'm pretty tall and this is quite a small bike, and I think a lot of people would assume that this is probably not the bike for them for being a little too small. So certainly if you are a shorter rider, then this would be a very good option for you. But even as a taller rider, I, in my personal experience, have found absolutely no problem riding this bike whatsoever. The foot pegs are in a fairly neutral position, the bars are fairly upright, the tank isn't too intrusive in terms of its size or its positioning. So to ride around every day, it's more than capable of doing that. The seat is surprisingly comfortable as well. For a bike of this type, you may assume that it can get quite uncomfortable after an hour or so. Even with my height and my weight, not a problem at all. It's worth mentioning though that this bike is by no means perfect, and there are a few things that do gripe on me a little bit, which I'll go through now. The first of which is the fuel tank and the fuel range, or rather the fuel gauge. So on a lot of bikes, it can be quite conservative. On this particular one, it is pretty conservative. So the bike will often tell you that you have a lot less range that you actually do. This often means that you can end up refueling when actually there's often between 20 and 30 miles range left. There will also be quite a lot of fuel left in the tank. Now, it does mean that you have to refuel it quite often, which is one thing in and of itself. It's quite another thing when you're having to refuel it when you don't necessarily need to. Now, I appreciate a lot of manufacturers do that to make sure that you don't run out of fuel, end up on the side of the road, have a bad experience, especially when you can't find somewhere where you can get fuel. But I think if you're riding around London a lot, I think if you're riding town a lot, if you're in an area where fuel stations are not that hard to find, especially somewhere like this, then it's not really too much of an issue. And so it does beg the question as to why the fuel gauge needs to be that conservative in the first place. The gauge itself is actually very nice, it's very neatly laid out, but it is just a bit of a nuisance. So to give you a numerical example, from what I could find online, it's estimated that the maximum range is about 160 miles, or at least from one specific source anyway. In my experience with this bike, the highest that I've been able to get the fuel gauge to go in terms of estimated range left is about 100 miles. There was another source that I found which reckoned that by the time it reads 0 miles left on the gauge, you have another 20 miles or so. But even so, it's not really a risk that I would like to take. I certainly wouldn't like to run the gauge down to 0, even with the knowledge in the back of my mind that actually the gauge is quite conservative. It's still not something I'd like to do, so I still find myself frequently refueling when I don't necessarily need to. The other thing to mention about this bike is that it does get very hot. Being a 1200cc parallel twin that does meet modern EU emission standards, it does get pretty warm. This bike does actually have liquid cooling, as does the Scrambler and the Thruxton, but even so, it is still a bit of an issue. Right now we're in March, the temperature is about 10-15 degrees Celsius, in and around that range. And even so, riding this around, you will notice that the fan does turn itself on. Now, whether that's fairly normal, it could be. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's a sign of overheating, but to me that does indicate that actually this bike gets pretty warm and in these cooler temperatures, which is a little bit of a concern. So if you do live in a hotter country, this may be a bit of an issue for you. Now, I don't know whether that's an issue specific to this bike. I don't know if that's an issue specific to a batch of these bikes or this model perhaps, but it is something which does crop up quite frequently online in certain forums, and I have noticed it on this bike. The other thing I would mention is the wiring. Now, this isn't a problem I've had to deal with firsthand. This is something that was more or less fixed under the previous owner. The wiring is a bit of an issue. So the indicators weren't always working properly. To be fair, still, they don't even work completely. It is now to the point where if you indicate whilst you are on full lock, the indicators do not work. That's not necessarily an issue because when you're riding around, you very seldom use full lock, so it's not something that bothers me tremendously, but it does bother me a little bit knowing that straight out the factory and being a relatively new bike, it was an issue. I suspect that's probably just because the wiring itself was a little bit too short, but I think in the modern day and age of motorcycles being so well made, frankly, it's an issue which shouldn't really exist. There are a couple of other common issues which I've been able to find online just doing a little bit of research about this bike. I say research, I mean looking up on Google. I'm going to get onto those a little bit later in the video, specifically because these are not issues I've encountered myself. Oh, there was one other thing which I will mention in this part of the video, just with regards to things I don't like. That is the fuel cap. The fuel cap Monza style looks fantastic, but is actually very fiddly and very irritating to use. Why Triumph couldn't come up with a better design than this, I don't know. The problem is, you would assume with something like this that the fuel cap would just open when you click the latch. It's not. Now, if it just had a screw cap underneath that was fairly easy to take off, that doesn't really concern me. The problem is you have to use the key to turn it. And when I actually tried to fill this with fuel the first time, I did have an embarrassing 2 or 3 minutes where I didn't know how to take the fuel cap off. To me, it just seems a little bit overcomplicated. It is a bit nitpicking, but for me, it's an overcomplication of something which doesn't really need to be that complicated. Okay, that's the nitpicking out of the way. Now onto the stuff I like. So the first thing to say about things that I really love about this bike is just the overall looks and the exquisite detailing that Triumph put into this. It is, with regards to competitors, it is just head and shoulders above everything else. The BMW R9T is quite a pretty bike. BMW certainly put a lot of effort into detailing and styling on theirs. The Z900 RS from the Kawasaki is also pretty good. But I just think in terms of looks, in terms of the attention to detail, the little things that Triumph pay attention to, it's just head and shoulders above the others, and it really is in a class of its own in that respect. Certainly the detail straight out of the box, like the bar end mirrors, which are a really nice thing to have as standard. Certainly the clocks, which are exquisitely detailed again. They always do a little dance at the beginning of every ride. The headlight as well, the brackets on them, just the way it's shaped and it's made. The fact that the fuel cap, when leant over, is always the right way up. Even the cover for the throttle body as well, and just the airbox covers as well. There's so many brilliant little details about this which work really, really well together. Even the little things, like the little 1200 HP badge on the side of the engine cover, is something I quite like a lot. There's other things as well, like the handling and just the way it moves. It's the short wheelbase which really helps with maneuverability to make it very flickable through corners. If I remember correctly, on the test ride launch of the motorcycle all the way back in 2019 now, I think it was somewhere in Spain, they deliberately chose a very twisty route, a very twisty road, in order to really bring the best out of this bike. I commute through London on this bike quite a lot, not quite every day, but a lot of days, and certainly weaving through traffic, filtering through traffic, just because of that, because of the short wheelbase, and also because of the power of the engine, the way that it delivers the power. It makes it fun, but not too frightening at the same time. If you just keep it in first gear and you have to do no more than 20 miles an hour just because of speed limits in that area, it's not too jerky, it's not annoying, it doesn't always necessarily want to go. It's very civilized, it's very comfortable, not a problem. But of course, if you get to an area where you do want to open up the taps a bit, then my God, has it got some punch. There are several times already from when I've ridden this bike where it just gives you a bit of what I would call a point and shoot mindset. With a lot of other bikes that I've ridden in the past, you often have to accommodate for the lack of power when it comes to things like overtakes, when it comes to things like going down straights or even going around through corners sometimes. This just feels like a machine where you can point and shoot it and it will do whatever you tell it to do. It definitely has the power to do that, and I love it for it. There are a couple of practical touches that are on this particular bike as well, albeit they are optional extras. Things like heated grips, for example, which on this particular bike as stock, Triumph have done a very nice job of. Often with a lot of aftermarket grips, especially some, when you fit them, they can look a bit weird. They're not particularly low profile. There is one pair of heated grips, which I think everyone knows about, where you do have the very chunky brick on the side, which just rather ruins the aesthetic of the bike. They're very nicely integrated. It's just a case of having one button on the left grip in order to adjust through a few settings. It's very low profile, it's very discreet, and especially on colder rides as well, it's a really, really nice touch. Tire pressure sensors as well, again, very handy to have. You don't necessarily need tire pressures, of course. If you have a flat tire, you know you're going to have a flat tire. But it's nice to have that system in place, just where it gives you a heads up if maybe it's a couple of PSI below where it should be. So the final thing I'll mention about the positives about this bike, the things that I really love, and this is quite a big important one, it's just the exhaust note, and it sounds absolutely brilliant. This particular engine does have a 270 degree crank, and that does help give it that sort of deep V-twin rumble, which is a really, really nice thing to have on a bike like this. Even as stock, the cans sound pretty good. This particular one has the aftermarket cans. I'm very pleased about that because that is the first thing I would modify with one of these bikes. It's already been done, so I'm very happy about that. Now, I mentioned earlier there were a couple of issues which a lot of people find with this bike that I haven't found on this particular one. I'm pleased to say they've already been dealt with. The first one which comes to mind is the fueling at low speeds. There are a few people who have mentioned that this is a bit of an issue and it does affect the throttle. At low speeds especially, it can feel quite jerky. On this particular bike, this has already had the booster plug and throttle spacer fitted. The throttle spacer especially is quite an easy modification to undertake. It's only a little piece of plastic as I understand. In any case, both of those have been fitted, and certainly riding around at low speeds, I haven't noticed any issues whatsoever. It feels perfectly smooth to me, and I'm very pleased to say it's not an issue. The other one was the squeaky brakes. Again, it's cropped up quite a lot, and it's not really something you would expect to find on a motorcycle of this caliber, especially one from Triumph, especially one this premium. On this particular bike, it has had a specific pair of brake pads fitted to mitigate this. As I understand it, they weren't particularly cheap. If you are in the market for them, if you find that you have this problem yourself, I will leave a link to them down below in the description. In any case, once they've fitted, no longer get squeaky brakes, and it's fixed. In terms of modifications I would do going forward, the first thing I would mention is probably the indicators. Now, I think these are, if I'm not mistaken, these are optional ones from Triumph. I would replace them with something a little different, especially at the rear. As a personal preference, I would prefer to have the rear taillight integrated with the indicators at the back. Happily on a bike like this, that is something very easy to do. As I understand it, there is a kit from Triumph which allows you to do that. So you can have the 3-in-1 indicators, so that gives you the rear light, the brake light, and the indicators all in one. That is something I will be looking to do, so that's very good. The mirrors, as I mentioned earlier, they do look pretty cool as far as stock mirrors go, but I will be looking to replace them with something a little bit different. Again, they will be bar ends. I may go for some of the Moto Gadget glassless ones, which I believe are polished aluminium. The other two modifications I would make to this bike would probably be the seat and the tank pad. I have mentioned earlier how surprisingly comfortable the seat was. The only reason I would change it really is just for the aesthetics. These bikes are particularly popular, and deservedly so, but I would probably want to change the seat just to help it stand out a little more, just to make it a little more my own. I believe there are quite a few things you can do in that respect. You can get quilted leather ones. There are all sorts of styles you can go for. I'd probably want to get a black seat in order just to keep in line with the colour scheme of the bike. That's something I'd replace. Not on comfort grounds, but more just to help with the look of the bike. The other thing I would do, as mentioned, is the tank pad. Now, I would put that just on the front. The reason being is just because of, well, long story short, just because of buttons, really. I think on a number of jackets, they do have the bottom 2 buttons rubberized in order to stop that happening. That is quite a nice touch when it appears, but even so, on this particular jacket here, even though they are fairly high up, they are still metal. And I wouldn't necessarily want them scratching on the wonderful, beautiful tank here. The other thing I might do, if I get especially bored one day and I find myself having far too much money, I may end up replacing the suspension front and rear. Front and rear. Now, with this being based on the Thruxton, thanks to the fact that it's based on the Thruxton, I understand that you can get Öhlins suspension for the front and rear. If you're looking to take the bike a little more seriously in terms of maybe even having a track day or two, that is something you can definitely do, and it may be something that I have in the back of my mind. It's something I may do one day, but I'm not too committed to. Certainly in the 2 weeks that I've had it and been around on it, I've not really noticed the suspension being an issue. It doesn't feel wallowy, it doesn't feel soft, especially going through corners. For me, so far, it feels absolutely fine. Although, as a disclaimer for that, I'm yet to sort of really take it to the limit just yet. So that may change. For now, though, it's a fairly basic suspension setup, but it feels absolutely fine. So that is everything I have to say with regards to my initial thoughts and impressions for the Triumph Speed Twin 1200. And that concludes this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it useful. I hope you enjoyed watching the video. If you have any feedback at all, good, bad, ugly, be sure to let me know in the comments below. Not spiteful, of course, in which case you should probably get a life. But anything constructive is more than welcome. I am hoping to make a few more videos like this with a bit more commentary in them. So if you do like this video, if you want to see more videos like this, again, be sure to let me know. Be sure to like the video and subscribe as well. Until the next video, my name's Ollie. Thanks again very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao for now.